Hey guys, it's Krista Watson here from Krista Quilts, and in this week's video, I'm going to focus on my Charming Chevrons quilt pattern. Now this pattern was originally made from my Good Vibes quilt fabric, but of course you can make it in any fabrics that you choose.
In the pattern, you can choose from 4 different sizes, and the best thing is I include 2 different quilting plans on how to quilt it.
The larger size is made from 10-inch squares, and the smaller size is made from 5-inch squares. In just a minute, I will tell you all about the different quilting plans, but keep this in mind, you can use either quilting plan for either layout. It's that versatile.
I'm excited to show you my Charming Chevrons quilt shown behind me, but I really want to focus in a lot on the machine quilting, because one of the questions I get asked all the time is how do I quilt my quilt without getting any puckers during the process? Well, puckers usually occur either when the batting is slipping inside of the quilt or if you're pushing the top fabric faster than the machine can keep up. So here's how to prevent it. Number 1, you want to use natural fiber materials so that they'll cling together. You want to baste your quilt really well, and you want to divide and conquer the process so you're only focusing on quilting one area at a time. So when I quilt my quilt, I actually start on the right-hand side of the quilt, work my way towards the center, rotate the quilt 180 degrees, and then start again in the middle and work my way over to the other side. The reason I quilt in this manner is it's the easiest way to control the bulk, and it allows me to anchor or secure the quilt in certain key areas so that it's not going to shift when I add more quilting later.
Here's my quilting plan for the smaller version of Charming Chevrons. So because I'm going to do my walking foot quilting first, I need to rotate the quilt 90 degrees so that I can stitch anchor lines in the ditch in between each row of blocks. I'm going to start with the first row on the right hand side, starting off the batting, and I'm going to stitch in the ditch very carefully along each side of the chevron shape. As I move my way down each row, I'm going to stop and pivot and rotate the quilt slightly so that I can follow along with the angle of the piece design. This is very easy to do, and I don't have to rotate it very much. When I reach the end of each row, I'm going to cut thread, and then I'm going to scooch the quilt over to quilt the next section. Once I've quilted my way about halfway across the quilt, I'm going to rotate the quilt 180 degrees, and now I'm going to pick up where I left off. So I'm still continuing to stitch in the ditch. I'm basically outlining each row of blocks. This is going to secure the quilt, and I can add additional quilting without it shifting on me. I'm going to do this in a very methodical manner, the left side of each row and the right side of each row. If you want to add a little extra pizzazz, as soon as you're done stitching in the ditch, you can actually add an echo line to each ditch line. So in my quilting plan, there's actually 2 lines drawn, which means that I'm stitching in the ditch, and then I'm also stitching about 1/4 inch away from each ditch to create a little bit of an echo that's really going to pop. Now you can take a look and see what that looks like on the actual quilt. So you can see that I'm stitching precisely in the ditch. Now, I do want to let you know that I have pressed all of my seams open, but there's no problems at all stitching in the ditch. When I sewed the quilt together, I sewed with a shorter stitch length of about 2.0 instead of 2.5, and that gave me nice, secure seams with a lot of thread in them that are not going to come apart. You can either use a walking foot or a built-in dual feed system, which is what I have on my machine. Now I have an open toe so that I can see what I'm doing, and my feed dogs are up. They are set for regular stitching. My stitch is just a regular straight stitch, and I've increased my stitch length for quilting to 3.0, which is going to help make up for any friction or drag on the quilt. Now, whenever you're doing any walking foot type quilting like this, you can really only stitch in one direction, so every time the design turns, you need to stop and pivot. I have a feature on my machine called a hover feature where the foot slightly raises as soon as I stop stitching, making it much easier to rotate the quilt. And this is what it looks like once everything has been stitched in the ditch on either side. When I add those echo lines, it really makes the design pop, and it's the same technique. So after I completed my anchor quilting and my echo quilting, I decided that I wanted to stitch a free motion design called switchbacks, and I'm doing this in each of the rows in between the blocks. So my quilting plan is basically telling me to start at the top of the quilt, and I'm still moving my quilt from top to bottom, but I'm quilting these switchback lines from side to side as I go. Now, as an option, you can rotate the quilt and stitch those switchbacks going up and down instead of side to side. The only issue is you'll have to rotate the quilt halfway in between because you won't have enough room to get the entire quilt under the machine. But sometimes it's easier to do this way depending on how comfortable you are with forming that free motion design. So I'm going to show you what it looks like quilting those switchbacks two different ways. The reason I'm showing you this is because sometimes you might find it easier to quilt a design up and down, while other times you might find it easier to quilt the design from side to side. Right now I'm stitching the switchback lines up and down, and I'm not worrying about how close they are or if they're perfect. With my free motion foot, my feed dogs have been dropped, and I'm controlling the stitch length based on how fast I'm moving the quilt in relation to the speed of my sewing machine. I'm using an open toe, and I'm not using a stitch regulator because that's kind of what I'm used to. But if I just go up and down, it makes a really nice, interesting texture, and I'm using a blending thread so that you only see the texture rather than the individual stitches. Now, on this part of the quilt, I am quilting those stitchback lines from side to side. If you're not sure how to form those lines, I recommend drawing it out on paper first so you get an idea for how the design is going to flow. This quilting plan is included in the pattern, and you can definitely try it out either way depending on what feels most comfortable. Here's another view showing me quilting those lines from top to bottom. That's the fun thing about free motion quilting. You get to decide what quilting motif you'd like to stitch and how you'd like to maneuver the quilt so it's easiest for you to accomplish. Now, if you're going to do it in this way, you're going to need to rotate the quilt when you're halfway through each row. It's not a big deal to do it that way, and like I said, in this quilt, I actually quilted those switchback lines in both directions to see which one I preferred. Now here's the back side of the quilt so you can really see what the quilting looks like so far. Let's continue on with the rest of this quilting plan. After I had quilted in between those background areas, I decided I wanted to quilt some simple wavy lines so that they would look like they're going in the opposite direction. I'm going to quilt all 4 rows on the right hand side. Then I'm going to rotate the quilt and continue quilting the rest of the rows until the job is finished. Now you can see what that looks like on the actual quilt. So again, I'm using my dual feed, and on my Bernina, I'm using the 20D foot so that I can really see what I'm doing. So before I started quilting those wiggly lines, I decided I wanted to do one more set of echo quilting on the inside of each of those blocks. Basically what that does is that shrinks up the space that I need to quilt, and it separates the designs just a little bit more. Because the fabrics are so busy, it's not really that noticeable, but it just gives me that little extra bit of quilting that really makes everything look nice. Just like my other quilting when I was stitching in the ditch and echoing, I am stitching along and then stopping with the needle in the down position. The width of those inner echo lines is the distance between the side of my foot and the needle, and you can decide how wide or narrow you want that to be. Now it's time to quilt those wavy lines. My settings are still the same for walking foot / dual feed quilting, which again, the feed dogs are up, the stitch length is a little bit longer, and I'm set to regular straight stitching. The way I form the wavy lines is that I just wiggle the quilt back and forth. It's a very organic, irregular look, and it's really a lot of fun to do and very fast. Here's a quick tip. When you're choosing between 2 machine quilting designs, if you can create contrast in the quilting with the designs going in different directions, that's going to help your eye move around the quilt, and it's going to make it look much more interesting. So now here's what the quilting looks like after it's all complete. So be sure to grab a copy of my Charming Chevrons quilt pattern and you can follow along.
Remember, all of the tips and techniques that I'm sharing can be applied to any quilt that you're making. And be sure to check out my quilt kit section to see what's new. I'm here to guide you every step of the way. I showed you how to make the Charming Chevrons quilt in the smaller size. This time around, I'm going to show you the very same thing with a different layout and a larger size using 10-inch squares. I'm going to show you how to do the quilting exactly as you see here, and I'm going to break down the process for you step by step. So before I start to machine quilt, I always make a quilting plan. Even if I don't stick exactly to the plan, it's a guide map to show me how I'm going to quilt the quilt and break down the process and which designs that I'm going to use. Remember to divide and conquer your quilting so it's not so overwhelming.
So just like I did in the smaller version of this quilt, for the larger version, I need to anchor and secure the quilt by stitching in the ditch in between the rows. I'm going to start at the top of the quilt and stitch in the ditch on the left and the right hand side of every single row. Once I reach the halfway point, I'm going to rotate the quilt 180 degrees and then finish stitching in the ditch in the other two rows. No matter how small or how big the quilt is, I do the anchor quilting first, and that's going to hold everything together so I can add more quilting later. Now let's take a look and see what that looks like. So you can see I've got just a little bit of batting and backing sticking out, and I start stitching in that area because it's going to get trimmed away later. Just like my smaller version of the quilt, I'm doing straight line quilting in the ditch. You'll notice that the area that I'm quilting in between my hands, I'm keeping nice and flat. So I'm not worrying about how big the quilt is, I'm only focusing on that area in between my hands. And I'm wearing quilting gloves that help me push the quilt through a little bit faster and a little bit easier. I'm using my 20D foot with my integrated dual feed, but again, you can do the same exact thing using a walking foot and you'd get the same results. I stop with my needle in the down position, I lift my foot if needed, and I rotate the quilt. Having that quilting plan in place really helps me understand which way I'm going to go to get the job done. Now I'll speed things up and just share a couple more tips while I'm stitching. So I'm using a blending 50 weight or fill 100% cotton thread in kind of a light yellow color because that's going to blend into the quilt so it's not going to stand out very much. And I'm using a natural fiber batting. My favorite is a cotton and wool blend because that's going to cling to the quilt and lessen the chance that I'm going to get any puckers. You'll also notice there's no pesky pins getting in my way as I stitch. That's because I used my spray basting technique where I used 505 basting spray and ironed the quilt after it was basted so it's not coming apart. Be sure to check out the description box for a link to my comprehensive spray basting tutorial if you want to learn more about that. Now that all of the anchor quilting is finished, it's time to move on to the free motion quilting plan. I'm going to pick two fun free motion fillers and quilt them in different areas of the quilt. So here's how I plan that out. I'm still going to start on the right hand side of the quilt and I'm going to fill in each of those sections that's marked in red. I start at the top of the quilt and then I work my way down one section at a time. Once I get to the halfway point of the quilt, I'm going to rotate the quilt 180 degrees and I'm going to finish off with that same free motion design in the other two rows of the quilt. Now let's see what that free motion quilting looks like on the actual quilt. If you wanted to, you could quilt the block areas first and then the background, or the background and then the blocks like I'm showing here. It doesn't really matter because that anchor quilting is keeping everything in place. Once I'm done with the first section, I'm going to cut thread, start in the next section in between the block rows, and continue with the same free motion design. Now, the actual design you stitch doesn't really matter, so this is where you can really have a lot of fun. So once that walking foot quilting is complete, I've dropped my feed dogs, I put my free motion foot on again with an open toe, and now I'm stitching a fun filler. The specific design that I'm doing is called a wavy line texture. I'm basically forming wiggly wavy lines from side to side. Now you might ask, what's the difference? Why would I quilt a free motion wavy line versus a walking foot wavy line? And it really depends on the area I'm trying to fill. When I'm filling in this texture from side to side, going back and forth, that would be very difficult to stop and rotate the quilt each time with the walking foot. So instead, I'm doing the free motion with the feed dogs drop, and that allows me to stitch in any direction that I like to. Right now, I'm doing horizontal wavy lines back and forth, but I could do vertical wavy lines as well. I'm filling in the same pattern in each area of the quilt, so again, it can be a little monotonous, but the way I think about it is it's my zen, happy place. I can just fill in the same fun texture no matter how much of the quilt I'm going to do. You'll notice as I stitch on the edge of the quilt, I don't have a whole lot of area for my hands to hold on to, so in that case I might just place a finger or two to hold on to the quilt. You also might see some stitching along the side. That's actually what I call a victory lap that I stitch on top of the quilt top even before I baste it. So there's nothing around the edges holding the quilt down. It floats freely so I can get all areas of the quilt. And the reason that I don't have a lot of batting and backing sticking out is so that it doesn't flip underneath me while I'm quilting. If you'd like to know how long it's going to take you to quilt this type of design, you can either make a practice block or you can time yourself while you're quilting one section of the quilt. See how long it takes you to quilt one block, and then you can apply that and kind of get a rough estimate of how long it's going to take you to quilt the entire quilt. Now I'm moving on to another section of the quilt where I'm filling in the area in between the blocks. But remember, on my quilting plan, I was able to start at the top of the quilt and go all the way down to the bottom. Here's a way to think about it. Anytime you have the same type of fabric, such as the lighter background fabric seen here, and that fabric is touching more of the same fabric, you can pretty much trace an unbroken line all the way across your quilt, and you can quilt that section continuously across the quilt. That reduces the amount of times you have to start and stop, and it allows you just to keep quilting and enjoy the process. Now, the nice thing about working from the right-hand side towards the center of the quilt, rotating and working back the other way, is at most you'll only have to deal with half of the bulk under the machine at any one time. So by the time you reach the middle point of the quilt, you'll know that it's never going to get any thicker or denser than that. And as you rotate and move your way back over to the other side, the bulk gets less and less. So it's a really good way to be very methodical and get the job done. Here's a bonus tip when it comes to your thread. You kind of want to keep an eye on your bobbin, and if it starts to get low or you're worried that you're going to run out of bobbin, stitch off the edge of the quilt and then put in a fresh bobbin. If for some reason you break a needle or you run out of thread, it's okay to stitch on top of a previous line of stitching to lock your stitches in place and keep on going. When you're quilting very densely on busy fabrics, you're not really going to see your starts and stops, and it's a great way to hide lots of imperfections. So I'm going to just continue filling in this same pattern over and over all the way across the quilt. It looks very dense and it looks very intricate, but it's really one of the easiest designs you can do. Now we'll finish up with the last bit of the quilting plan, which is some really fun swirls quilted in the main block areas. You know the drill. Once you quilt half of the quilt, you rotate it and you finish up block by block, row by row. This design I'm doing is a takeoff on some of my really fun swirl designs that I like to do. Most of the time when I'm quilting, I try out different variations of some of my favorite designs just to change things up a little bit. So you can see the other quilting in place as I come back and finish in with those swirls. This is probably the easiest part of the quilt because there's not going to be hardly any shifting, and all I have to do is fill in each section of the quilt. Now technically I could begin anywhere on the quilt that I wanted to, but I'm still going to work my way from right to center across the quilt, rotate and work from my center back towards the other direction. Now in this busy fabric, there's lots of different colors, but that yellow thread still blends in. You can see it on some of the darker colors, and then it blends into some of the lighter colors. However, once I fill in this entire quilt with stitching, all you'll see is that really yummy texture. Now, it's really fun in my quilts to combine curvy designs with angular ones. I stitched those angular wavy designs in the background, and now the curvy designs kind of help complement it. So again, I just work one section at a time, but I can quilt an entire row because each of the same block fabric is touching the next fabric, and so I don't have to stop and start and tie off. When I plan my quilting designs, I usually like to do as much continuous stitching as possible. It's easy, it's fast, and it's very carefree. Just a couple comments to remind you of that I mentioned earlier. The open toe free motion foot allows me to see what I'm doing. My feed dogs are dropped so I can stitch in any direction, and having those gloves really helps me push the bulk of the quilt through the machine, and I'm only working on the area in between my hands. You'll notice I'm scrunching and smushing and moving the quilt out of the way. It's what I like to call hills and valleys. The valley is the area in between my hands, and the hill is the bulk of the quilt around my hands, so I don't care what's happening in the hills. As long as the valleys are nice and flat and smooth, it's going to be easy to stitch. And way back when I told you that I pressed my seams open, not only does it make it easier to stitch in the ditch, it makes it easier for my free motion foot to glide over the blocks, because there's no bulk getting in the way that's going to hang up my needle and cause any puckers or lumps or bumps in my quilt. In my videos, I'm trying to show you more of the quilting at actual speed, and you can hear a little bit of the stitching. You'll notice that I actually stitch very quickly. I'm used to kind of putting pedal to the metal, but free motion quilting is all about finding the right rhythm of your hands with the rhythm of the machine. If you'd like to slow down, that's perfectly fine. You'll find a comfortable pace that works for you. I also like to show lots of different angles when I'm quilting so you can really see how these designs are formed. Now, a lot of times you don't really see the design, all you see is texture, because I'm quilting with the real thread colors that I would actually use on a quilt. My little pet peeve is a lot of times when you see demonstrations and they're quilted with the super dark thread, I don't like that because it shows all the imperfections. I would rather hide my mistakes, camouflage the flaws, and just enjoy a yummy, cuddly quilt. The fun thing about this swirl design is you can angle it in and out of any spot on the quilt that you need to. You can make your swirls big, you can make them small, you can pretty much shrink them and enlarge them to fit the area that you're quilting. Even when you're quilting like a half square triangle like I am, it's not a problem to move and meander your way around the area to quilt, and then you jog over in the seam to get to the next section that you'll be quilting. So I'll continue to quilt like this methodically until the entire area is filled in. Now I'll speed it up and you can watch a few more stitches and just get lost in the fun texture of the free motion quilting. Look at all that yummy texture. This is my favorite thing to do, and it's not hard at all once you break it down step by step. Just remember, you're going to get better with each and every quilt you make, so dive in and give it a try, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. After all, the way we learn is just to keep on going and make quilt after quilt, and it sure is fun experimenting. Until next time, happy quilting!